Hello and welcome to Maulana Azad National Urdu University's Global Classroom. Today we have with us two eminent internationally renowned linguists to share their views on language and thought. This topic, language and thought, is going to be discussed by the two panelists. May I first introduce to you Professor V. Prakasham from CIFL. Professor Prakasham has recently retired from CIFL, which is now called the English and Foreign Languages University. There, he was associated with the Center for English Studies in the School for Distance Education. He was also formally associated with the Punjabi University. Professor Prakasham specializes in general linguistics and implied linguistics and has more than 4 decades of teaching experience. I welcome you, sir, to the TV studio. Thank you so much for being with us today. We also have with us Professor Christian Mathieson, Chair, Linguistics, Macquarie University, Australia. Professor Mathieson is the leading theoretician of systemic functional linguistics, which embraces both the cognitive as well as the social aspect of language. I welcome you, sir, to the studio. Professor Mathieson has written extensively on linguistics, and today we have him here to explain to us the relationship between language and thought. Professor Mathieson, while we discuss the relationship between language and thought, I would also like you to tell us whether these two are two independent entities or is language dependent on thought. And while we are discussing this, will you also throw some light on the cognitive view of language vis-a-vis the communicative view of language?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our discussion and our engagement with your students here. And there are two senses in which language creates thought, I think. The first sense is just simply when we talk about thought, thinking, knowledge, mind, memory. It's important to realize that these are all constructed in language. They're constructed in meaning. We say they're construed, so constructed as meaning. So in this sense, thought is constructed in language. So for example, right, early on, second, third year, the child can construct as meaning experience of the concrete world, the world we can see, touch, listen to, smell, and so on. And this is then through the grammar that's available to the child. But into the fourth year, the child is beginning to move into the world of abstract experience. So things you can't touch, you can't see, you can't smell, you can't hear. And one example from Claire Painter is a child that she studied said, around 4 years of age, balance means you hold it on your fingers, so your hand, and it doesn't go, it doesn't fall. Right. Now, this is now constructing through language, through the resource of language, this very abstract notion of balance, and is taking this whole experience that the child is engaged with. You hold it on your hand, okay, and then it doesn't fall, and reconstructing this as balance. So if you give attention to language, you will see all along what the cognitivists, the cognitive scientists, talk about as thought, cognition, is actually meaning constructed in language. Now this is meaning in an experiential sense, constructing our experience for ourselves in language. But language does other things too, and of course it does this kind of exchange, right? Language as interaction, as interpersonal function. And the important point here then is that thought is not just kind of in the isolated mind, right? It's not purely subjective, it's actually constructed in our interaction, right? So it's constructed interactively. And a great psychologist, developmental psychologist, Colburn Trevarthen, has called this intersubjectivity. And so if you actually look at what happens to young children, you can see this kind of development. Now you could fast forward to the children as they develop, they move into school, primary school, secondary school, and so on. And what you find is they learn other meaning-making systems. Mathematics would be one, for example. And they will learn drawing, perhaps. I mean, they'd probably been drawing before they enter primary school. They will learn geometry, may engage with music. Now that means that in addition to this primary meaning-making system language, the children will have expanded resources. And if you look at discussions of language and thought, one of the ways in which people have tried to say, language has nothing to do with thought is to say, well, a number of people say we think geometrically. Well, of course they do, right? Because geometry is also a semiotic system. It's also a system of meaning making, right? But that means that it's added onto the resources of language, right? So language is the primary experience, and then this develops further. So we have to think of language as a resource for meaning, for thinking. So that would be a kind of basic way of exploring this question of language and thought.
Thank you, Professor Matheson. Professor Matheson has told us how language is involved with meaning. He has also told us how thought is constructed through language. And towards the end of his talk, he told us how language is a resource. We now move on to Professor Prakasham. Sir, I would like you to elaborate on the concept of linguistic sign as propounded by Saussure. And while you are at it, will you also explain to our students what is meant by the signifier and the signified?
In modern linguistics, this term is very commonly used, but not all people comprehend it from all angles. Technically, S-I-G-N sign, the plural of which is signs, which is different from science.
Yes.
So there is that science called semiotics, which is defined as science of signs. You can see that.
Yes.
So this sign is expected to have two aspects: signifier and signified. For example, when you take a dog, it's barking. You don't have that kind of variation. But if you take human language, in one language what is called tree, in another language it is paid.
Yes.
In my own language Telugu, it is chettu. The signified is the same. I will come to that. There is a problem there. There is a catch there. The signified is one, but signifiers are many. So the linguistic sign has two aspects. The content aspect, that the signified, again that also begs some questions, I will come to that. The expression side, which also has different aspects, that is the signifier. Signifier is one which signifies. Signified is one which is signified. Together there is linguistic sign. If there is a word without meaning, it is not sign. If there is a kind of idea without a word, without an expression, that is not a sign. So this is clear. But when we come to signifier, it can be verbal, oral, speech, it can be written, it can be symbolic. If there is a cross symbol on a car, they are writing nothing, but they know it is medical.
Yes.
It refers to health, etc. So there are ways of using this kind of signifier. And then the word fire refers to fire. But fire has several other things. He was all fire, means he was angry. So the signified is not simple, nor is the totally signifier. The fire itself becomes a signifier for something else. Passion, purifier. Fire purifies. So that is where it is a continuous cognitive process. And then idea and item, whatever you can recognize as an object and whatever you have in your mind, both of them come under signified. So this linguistic sign has two clear aspects, but that is not that simple. Each has its own real manifestations. I'll just tell you something. The cognitive idea is represented by the linguistic label, and the linguistic label signifies the physical item. That is where a triangular thing, once upon a time I.R. Richards also did that. So I have my own thing: idea, label and item. Here we include both concrete and abstract experience in the word physical. See, if there are 20 chairs, there are no 20 ideas, and there is only one idea of chair, one concept of chair, one model of a chair. That model is physical. The item, the chair itself or the fire, expounds or realizes the idea. That is why in ancient days Greeks discussed this, which is more real, the idea or the idea of chair or the chair itself. Chair can be destroyed, the idea cannot be destroyed. So you cannot say idea doesn't exist. It's a very peculiar thing. So, and similarly, idea is manifested in the item. When I look at a chair, immediately the idea comes back to my mind. So, the idea is manifested in the item which expounds it. The idea is fixed in our minds by the label which represents it. That is why after discussing a lot, hey, what do we call this? Oh, now I understand. That means that small label make you feel, that's it. Actually, that little label, the linguistic label, is a capsule of so much of information. So much of thinking process has been fed into it. And then the use of the label is reinforced by the item which is signified by the label. That is why we need technical terms to understand. If you say oxygen, that is a technical term for the kind of air which we need to breathe in. Every time we don't say, hey, is there air to breathe in? Is there oxygen? That is good enough. That is how the language and thought, the thought as we understand is through the meaning we really get to. And let us be very clear, meaning is not independent of language. Yes. I always give an example. In English, you have catch and hold. In Urdu, we have pakadna.
Yes.
Is pakadna catch? No. Is pakadna hold? No, it is both. It is neutral to the distinction of catch where object is in motion and hold where object is not in motion. So, what is it pakadna conveying? That means that conveying and this, that is exactly why it is a linguistic sign.
Right.
The signified is not independent of the signifier, the signifier is not independent.
So, while Professor Prakasham has simplified the science of signs while going into its complexity, I would like to add 1 or 2 points. While it is very easy for our Urdu learners to understand a sentence like the building is on fire, they may be at a loss to understand another sentence where it says he was fired. So, the concept of being removed from one's job by using the word fired is something that is new to them. So, while the word fire is common in both the places, they may not be able to associate it immediately with the meaning that is being presented there. And Professor Prakasham just now talked to us about pakadna, where in English we have catch and hold. There is another word, awaz. It is the same word in Urdu for both voice and sound. So, a person dealing with the topic sound in physics will still use the word awaz. Let us now move on to Professor Mathieson. Professor Mathieson, what are your views on the aspects of linguistic relativism and linguistic determinism as presented in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
Yes, again fascinating and very central to the whole question we're exploring. Let me just add that in the sign, the signified, that is of course the core of meaning, so we're concerned with meaning, and language is then a system of these signs. And when you go from proto-language, the child tongue that we talked about before, into the mother tongue, it's an expansion of the system, so more signs, but it's also a total transformation of the system to be able to mean many things at the same time, more things at the same time, and have more sort of power of meaning, a greater meaning potential. Now, this question is often posed in these terms of determinism. I would like to turn it around, right? Not determinism, but look at it from a constructive point of view. Now, in our exploration of this, we take a constructivist approach, and we spelled this out in a book, Michael Halliday and myself. Halliday is our guru. He's the originator of a very, very interesting 21st century oriented theory of language that is being developed around the world. Now, constructivism then means that you think of this really as language empowering us rather than sort of straitjacketing us, determining what we can think. Now, if you go back to this developmental perspective and you think about from the point of view of the development of a child learning about the world, learning language, and the two going together, then you can say, where does this come from the child's point of view? So, not that the child thinks about this consciously, but the whole experience, the whole what we refer to in everyday terms as thinking processes, cognition, mind, knowledge, and so on. This is empowered by language. It's not determined by language, it's empowered by language. So in this sense, language is a kind of opening up, an expansion, not a kind of straitjacketing determinism, okay? And of course, the sky's the limit, as it were. So language makes this possible. Now, we'll come back to language and the brain, I think, later on, because this is a critical juncture in the whole discussion. But I would also like to mention this in relation to then relativism, right? Now, in some sense, we all have the same brains, we all live on the same planet. So in a very broad sense, in the human family, the general envelope of our existence is the same. And if you think back on the evolution of language, and this probably takes us to 150, 200,000 years ago, you know, when our colleagues in other disciplines talk about the emergence of anatomically modern humans, they abbreviate these AMHs, or Homo sapiens sapiens. I'd like to say, well, these were also LMHs, linguistically modern humans. So it was a kind of package deal, anatomically modern with our modern brains, but also linguistically modern. And we'll come back to this, I think, in the later part of the discussion. But the whole point is, from this emergence of language on the order of in its modern form, 150 to 200,000 years ago, then there is a long period where we can say very little about the patterns of development, but it's clear that it's a sort of out of Africa story, right? So on the order of 100,000 years ago, so our ancestors began to migrate out of Africa. They'd all been migrated out of East Africa into other parts of Africa. And so we get this gradual divergence of different languages. Now, with the divergence of different languages, you get very interesting adaptations to different environments, but you get also the whole rich cultural development, cultural histories. So different languages have developed different angles on the world, different angles on experience. And this is very, very complex. It's very important not to treat it as a sort of simple matter of single words, as is often done, but the whole systems of engaging with the world. And you have to take that relative to what the nature of human experience is and what's demanded of that language. If you look across the Eurasian culture band, then on the whole there are a lot of similarities. I mean, Eurasia has a sort of long shared history and a lot of commonalities. Okay, so that's very important. But if you look to societies today, for example, that have a more of a hunt and gathering kind of subsistence, then that's a very different take on experience. And I think this is where we have to come in and sort of ask, what is it like to construe experience when you live under these conditions? And that is a sort of complex way of understanding relativism. So yeah, as always, you have to be careful not to sort of set up just it's either A or is B, but you have to say, well, it's both A and B. You know, it's not just thesis, it's not just antithesis, but it's some kind of synthesis. So against the background of our shared human experience and the resources that are built into all languages for construing a human experience, our experience of happenings, events of different kinds, of time, of space, of action, active agents and so on, we also have to look at the different models that have evolved, so developed slowly, unconsciously over time, for different angles on experience. And this is something that Wolff drew attention to. Now, Wolff was a brilliant scholar. He came from outside linguistics, the study of language, but that meant that he brought sort of fresh thoughts into it. He's probably, in the among thinkers of language, the most widely misrepresented and misunderstood in the 20th century. And there is a passage in Pinker's The Language Instinct where you get total misrepresentation of Wolff. Pinker tries to demolish Wolff by saying that he worked on Apache, but he never met Apache speakers. Well, this is very strange because Wolff worked on Hopi, right? And there are news articles from the 1930s in local newspapers where Wolff lived talking about how he met speakers. And one eminent linguist who was a student with Wolff under Sapir, Mary Haas, she talks about how Wolff would gone for months into the Hopi community. So he had very deep experience with Hopi, and he showed in very sophisticated ways how there are different ways of construing the sort of whole phases of becoming. And that, I think, it's that that we have to probe. And when we think about relativism, we should not start with sort of very simple things like colors and so on. We should think about whole ways of construing complex domains of experience, including, I think, the social world, right? The world that you can't really test through vision or the hearing system and so on. So it has a very important place. And I should just like to mention that there is very, very interesting psycholinguistic research now in Europe, sort of team based in Heidelberg and Paris, with scholars like Christiane von Stutterheim and Marie Lambert, for example. And they're doing very interesting psycholinguistic experiments showing how important the mother tongue is. Okay? What they're showing is that it's not a matter of first perceiving, then thinking, then communicating, verbalizing. It's very different from that. They show that mother tongue speakers of different languages, right at the phase of perception, right, their perceptions, process of perception will be different. So language comes right at the beginning. So we attend to different things depending on what our mother tongues are. So for example, if you contrast German and English, German is very result-oriented. So you can see in tracking the eye movements, for example, of people watching a video, the German speakers are sort of looking, where is the result? And they won't start reporting until they've seen the result. But English doesn't have this result orientation, and they're not so concerned with the result, and they will start verbalizing, reporting before the result is there. Why? Well, because of the affordances, the possibilities of the language. So there is a lot of new research that illuminates this, and to me, this is, a fascinating kind of confirmation of Wolff's notion of relativism, but a sophisticated understanding of it, not the misrepresentation that you often get in the literature.
Now that we are running out of time, I would like Professor Prakasham to quickly tell us his views on thought being independent of language. A little while ago, you did mention that language is not always dependent on thought.
Thought has to be seen from two angles. Thought in someone's own cerebral system or cognitive system. Thought as reflected in his speech and actions. We have access to someone's thought only through his language and actions. Actions, many times we say this is what he wanted to do, he did it. But we really attribute motives, what they call in law, mens rea and all that, through speech, thinking. So the speech we have access to gives us access to his thought only to that extent. Beyond that, we don't really have real access. But there are people who say, I have a strong feeling, I have an idea, but I don't have a really very appropriate word to express it. That means there are sometimes some ideas which you cannot express. That means language may be expressing to an extent what we think, but we have access to someone's thinking only through language. So we have to keep that in mind. Language, thought which is expressed are expressible, the thought which is not expressed. Many dreams we forget, might be dreams have a source to show what kind of thinking goes on without getting verbalized. And this also is reflected in how we look at translation. We somehow think we can translate it in a sense, well, it doesn't matter yet. After all, I am saying the same thing. How do you know you are saying the same thing? So translation has to be taken as a very serious process. I have a very peculiar definition for it. Recreation of the content of an expression of a language in terms of another language. Mind you, recreation of content is not this transfer of content, though word translate means carry across. So my mathematical formula is, when we create content C1 of an expression E1 of a given language Lx in an expression E2 of another language Ly, what we are doing is creating a new comparable content C2. So translation is creation of comparable content. So exactly, I gave a simple explanation. Pakadna, catch and hold.
Yes.
And I tell many people, you please translate the Urdu word gham, kariye. Not possible. There is a beautiful expression in High Urdu, Hamzulf. Translate it. Hamzulf is my wife's sister's husband is my Hamzulf. You say Sadhu, brother-in-law. No, it doesn't capture the beauty of that Hamzulf.
Yes.
Zulf refers to hair. See the beauty. Hamdard, Hamsafar,
Yes.
Hamshakal, Hamzulf. That is, I have access to my wife's Zulf, and that man has access to my wife's sister's Zulfe. What a beautiful expression. How can you translate?
Yes.
So, translation, that is where Darida is not wrong when you say there are many areas which are not translatable. Because that is, there is a beautiful expression, Shabdarthau Sahitau Kavyam. Literature is the union, inseparable union of meaning and expression. It is not just literature. Every sentence we come out with, that expression is creating that meaning for that moment. I want to drink, please, is different from I want to drink a water, please. Same word I used. That drink is different from this. So, translation, I always tell people, especially when you are translating a famous poem, and more importantly scriptures like Quran or Bible or Bhagavad Gita, should be like critical care of a plastic surgeon. Every word has to be properly chosen. If an Arab word has two meanings, last and latest, you have to choose which word fits in. Prophet Muhammad is the last of
The prophets.
the prophets. If you say he is the latest of the prophets, meaning changes. Word is the same. One has to be extremely cautious, and no one should try to play with serious poems and scriptures while translating.
Yes. Right. I thank both the panelists for being with us today and sharing their views with us. But don't you think, even though this was a very enriching experience, there is still lots more that we can learn? Yes, I feel the same. And this is exactly what happens, especially when you're in the midst of stalwarts like Professor Prakasham and Professor Mathieson. I thank you both once again. And to our own students, feel free to write in to us at the Director, Directorate of Distance Education, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Gachibowli, Hyderabad 500032. So until we meet again next time, this is Dr. Gulfishan Habib signing off. Goodbye and take care.